Hello everybody, I hope you can hear me okay, and I really wanted to start off this pre-recorded video by expressing how deeply sorry I am that I can't be with you all today whilst giving this talk. I have been battling some pretty nasty flu over the last week or so, and it just wouldn't be feasible, and of course I wouldn't want anyone to get sick. Luckily, it's not COVID, which is a good thing given the context of the talk that I'm about to give today about my game. But hopefully we can kind of all take something with us from this experience today. So hello, my name is Dr. Adam Jarrett from the University of Portsmouth, and I am here today to talk to you about my game, What We Take With Us, and the title of the talk is What We Take With Us from Personal Game Creation from Conception to Reportage. Now, the major takeaway from this talk today is primarily the idea that perhaps the way we think about making these kinds of small, indie, personal, and inclusive games, while a lot of the approaches to it can be quite well-meaning, we don't necessarily always talk about some of the hardships around some of that development. And indeed, when I was creating my game, there were some pretty turbulent points. So I wanted to talk to you about that today. Not to depress you or anything, but to kind of figure out how we can together make these kinds of endeavors a lot more sustainable. Because when I went into this project, I thought that it would be easy, and it wasn't quite that. So let's go through the journey, and I will take you with me. Okay, so I think one of the first things to figure out within this space is this idea that like personal games come out of this almost niche subgenre of independent game development or indie game development. And generally indie game development is quite evangelized within the industry. It's this idea that like if you just have enough luck and passion, you'll be able to find success. And realistically, that's not necessarily what the market dictates in 2024. Personal games are, however, becoming an increasing niche within the kind of indie game genre. It is something, this idea of cozy games or personal games, games like Venba, games like Sibel, all those kinds of things are reaching kind of specific audiences. And that's really important because what it shows us is that it shows us these kinds of personal games about our own personal lives and personal stories can have real impact. And that's really important. And in terms of kind of the development process, personal games kind of align a little bit with that idea of auteur theory, which is just this idea primarily that you are making a product primarily as a way for you to process it yourself, as opposed to the kind of traditional way we think about games. Excuse me. The traditional way we think about games that tends to be a little bit more player-centric. However, this idea of making the game for yourself, whoever's going to play it, and going through that process is in itself a process that creates meaning. It's a process that can be researched, that can be studied, and primarily it's a process that we can learn a lot from as developers, right? This idea that like, turns out making games is hard, but also making games where you're thinking about your own personal thoughts, feelings, and values lets you chew on some of those things a little bit, which can make it a really enriching experience. And that kind of, that thread really comes through in a lot of the work in academia and industry that talks about these things, right? So within academia, we're seeing things like personal game jams or like cozy game jams that are starting to become popular, primarily as ways for kind of newer game developers to get into the game development scene who wouldn't typically be call themselves game developers. But you have a lot of easy development tools these days. Things like Bitsy, things like Twine, even things like GB Studio, for example, are all really good ways that you can make games, usually with visual interfaces in the modern day, that look and feel like real small games. And because they're kind of often quite limited in their tool set, they are really rich platforms to be able to tell these kinds of narrative stories. So this idea kind of comes across, kind of within the research, speaks to this idea of game design as this reflective practice thing and this therapeutic process where, like, especially when you're in a game jam, you're working with other people, it's social, but you also have to think about how you're going to abstract your real life experience into a game, but you're also learning new skills because you're now developing games. Congratulations, you are a game developer. And that kind of then feeds into this idea of Design Bleed by Toft and Harrer, which is this idea that like bleed is a term from role playing that suggests that the character in the role playing and you as the player are kind of merging your experiences into one. So the idea is that the experience or your own thoughts and feelings are bleeding into each other. So the idea of Design Bleed was, okay, well, let's take this idea of role-playing bleed and apply it to the design process and try to figure out how can we make our lives bleed into our games. And indeed, that has a fair amount of success. The industry kind of broadly talks about ways that these kinds of games can explore a bunch of different kinds of experiences. Obviously, with these kinds of games, personal games, it's often quite easy to explore the negative life experiences, but there have been other developers who've kind of suggested that exploring positive experiences as well with these kinds of things, with these kinds of like real cute, cozy experiences might be a nice idea. So games like Unpacking, for example, although that's not necessarily a personal game, has that same vibe where like the whole game is quite positive and cozy throughout the process. So it's not necessarily having to be this shocking thing that you have to explore. Right. And importantly here, the main thing about these kinds of games, about personal games, is that it shows players that they're not alone. And that's really important. I'm sure many of you sitting in the audience today, that's one of the reasons that you come to games, and especially come to games like the games we'll see at the conference today, is this idea that like these are games about other people's experiences, and maybe I have some of these experiences too. I'm not alone. That's a good thing. And ultimately, a lot of these games are like labors of love, right? It's this idea of like really wanting to showcase what your experience was. And then there are obviously, like I said, a bevy of successful game examples. We've got That Dragon Cancer, which obviously garnered quite a lot of hype on its release. Still breaks me to this day. It is definitely that cancer game. But then also similarly, Sibel, which is a story about a girl's kind of first sexual experiences. And then Venba, which is a more recent one about kind of being a Canadian immigrant, so an immigrant living in Canada, and kind of food culture around children's ideas of like, your lunch doesn't smell the same as mine, or weird stuff like that, which is definitely a experience that a lot of immigrants can draw from, myself included. I'm a child of a Polish mother, and some food is quite sour. Let's just say that. So yeah, as you can see, broadly quite positive in terms of its perspective. So I was like, cool, let's do that. I'm going to make a personal game because it's cool. So I made what's called a putty pervasive game. That's just a fancy way of saying a game that's played in real life that has multiple distinct formats. So it's kind of similar to transmedia storytelling, but it isn't really. And each format here is a standalone experience. I'll show you a diagram in a second. So there were three of them. There was an online alternate reality game, or an ARG. There was a physical room-based game, which was kind of inspired by escape rooms, but wasn't really an escape room. And then there were also game-based workshops. And the approach that I took here is this idea of values-conscious design, which comes primarily from kind of human-computer interaction and Flanagan and Nissenbaum, which is about the idea of focusing on particular values within design. Sorry. Often pro-social ones. And in this case, the chosen value that I chose here was well-being. And it was important to note that like what we take with this primarily is about my own experiences with the COVID-19 pandemic. Which again, like I said, today is a lovely reminder of in terms of my immune system. And broadly, the game kind of has players complete wellness tasks. That is the game. It is pretty simple. Hopefully, I'll have some time at the end to show you what it looks like. So this is what the game kind of looked like. You had an ARG. The ARG was primarily played on Discord, but also had some links to YouTube videos with the protagonist, Anna Kurlitz. A lot of Anna's story is primarily based around my own experiences within the pandemic. So that's where the kind of personal autobiographical nature came from. And then there was the room-based game. That looks like a nice office, you might say. That's because that's what it was. It wasn't quite an escape room in the sense that you didn't have to escape the room. You just went into this office and you played the game, which is a series of wellness tasks within this space that is particularly Anna's space, the protagonist's space, and how are you going to feel about playing this particular game that asks you about your wellness and well-being while you're in someone else's space as opposed to your own, for example. And then because we had a digital game to work with, even though the digital game is kind of moreover a series of tasks on a website, I then kind of used that as a way to create a bunch of in-person workshops and online workshops to have players get together and play through the game and then kind of come together and chat about what their experiences were. So the research methodologies here primarily was research through design. So this idea that you don't necessarily have to make the thing and study the thing specifically to get research data out of it, but ideally the entire design process is a research process. And then also ethnography, because the game was kind of semi-autobiographical, that made a lot of sense. And I was a big part of elements of the ARG and elements of the room and stuff. It made it very easy to kind of examine the game, interestingly, like from a player designer type perspective, which is not really done in games. Oftentimes we think about autoethnography specifically from a player perspective, which isn't problematic. It's just the idea of having an autoethnography from a designer is a little bit more akin to postmortems within the industry. And then narrative inquiry was kind of the final one where I looked at players' reactions to the game. And I did so by getting them to basically figure out what the stories of their experience was throughout the play of that game. So kind of the way I presented that research was that you had stories of what players went through and kind of how their thoughts and feelings changed. Because again, I think for me, that's one of the most important things about games research is that, like, ultimately everyone's going to have a different opinion and different reaction to your thing. So the thing that I want is the individual stories where we can make sure that we're making a difference. Anyway, let's get on to some of the findings. There are many, because there are many steps. So step 1, ideation. This is basically the concepting stage, figuring out what kind of game I was going to make. And what I found was that in some game types, especially like escape rooms, focusing on mechanics might lessen the narrative emotional impact. So there was a study done on kind of creating empathy-based escape rooms, whereby because it was an escape room, people were always trying to escape the room as opposed to looking at the narrative content within it. So that was kind of difficult, right? How do you make a game that is quite mechanics light and encourages a lot of narrative kind of problem solving and finding? There were a couple of problems with the term empathy generally. Empathy games is this kind of catch-all term that we're seeing still kind of 4 or 5 years into when I started this research, where it's like, oh, it's a game to promote empathy. And it's like, is it empathy though? What is empathy to everyone? So there is a little bit of terminological confusion around that. And then throughout the ideation process, I created a bunch of frameworks to kind of approach this kind of serious game design. I won't bore you with them here, but they are published if you'd like to go and find them. So primarily, one of the big things here within this process is this idea that, like, when we talk about these kinds of serious games, because inevitably they are a little bit serious in nature, we're all talking different languages oftentimes. Some people are calling them empathy games. Some people are calling them ethical games. Some people are calling them serious games, etc., and so forth. And oftentimes within the literature, we can't actually define exactly what we're talking about, even though we're all talking about similar things, which made finding research on this kind of stuff a little bit difficult at times. So the main kind of takeaway here that I propose is kind of leaning on this idea of values-conscious design from Flanagan and Nissenbaum as this umbrella term to go, there's a whole bunch of values we can explore within these kinds of games. Focusing on one and marketing that one is probably going to be a pretty good indicator, hopefully, of some degree of success. All right, on to creation, step 2. It was really, really hard for a variety of reasons, not least of them the fact that the pandemic was still ongoing when I started making this game, which made things like, how are we going to do an escape room type game when there's social distancing happening? A potential problem. But more than that, developing any game, solo in a pandemic was just really, really difficult. There were a lot of mental barriers, lots of days where I just didn't want to do it. And there was also a lot of emotional labor involved as well, right? Like, I'm putting my heart and soul into this game because it's a personal game. That is a difficult thing that we need to wrestle with when we're making these kinds of things. This kind of process, basically, is it's not as easy as going, it'll be fine. It'll help players not feel alone. Like, the point here is that it's a difficult process that can be tough to wrestle with sometimes. And then we had deployment. Oh boy. So what we take with us was a pervasive game. So what that meant is that primarily it was played in real life. We had the room where people would go in and play and come out and talk to me about their experiences. But there was also an online ARG on Discord where Anna was interacting with players for about 3 months. I was basically playing Anna. And there was a whole community bustling, and we were all sharing stories and sharing our tasks that we were doing. And there was a whole story that was kind of slowly coming out about who Anna was and what had happened to her and all these kinds of things. And that was kind of the whole experience, and it was supposed to be this quite physical, intimate experience where even if you were playing it remotely, as some of our players were, they felt quite connected to Anna as opposed to kind of specifically playing a digital video game and playing it on screen. However, lots and lots of difficulties around participation and advertising. Even though we are aware of things like ARGs and escape rooms in the modern day, it's not a format that people tend to go, yes, I want to play that. It's a lot easier to kind of open up and play a digital game, which kind of led to a couple of questions around how suitable these kinds of genres are. I still think that they're incredibly relevant, primarily because they are the lens to let you immediately do the thing. But there were also like some other post-pandemic problems, because by the time we deployed this, it was 2023. Pandemic was a little bit more behind us. So a lot of people didn't really care about some of the very specific pandemic references that were in the game and kind of wanted to steer clear of some of those a bit. And that speaks to some interesting conversations that need to be had around the industry broadly in terms of post-pandemic development and kind of deployment. Is like, what does launch look like post-pandemic when we're all back at work and nobody's playing our games anymore, or the kind of that big spike that we had during COVID drops off. Similarly, all those bad things led to very, very severe imposter syndrome, and also because it was a pervasive game, there was a lot of physical labor involved in the process of like monitoring the Discord server for the ARG, making sure the YouTube videos were up on time, cleaning up the room before players had to come in, and so on and so forth. And then also, obviously, doing the data collection. All of that was really draining because it was quite an emotional game, very emotional experience in terms of gathering user data for it as well. So that was a bit tough, but we're almost done, I promise. Oopsie. So yeah, Reportage. At the end of it, even though a lot of my journey was quite difficult, those who played the game really enjoyed it. And there were even elements of this idea of transformative play. Specifically, the actor who played Anna, she had this major moment of breakthrough while she was kind of helping me finish up the touches on the game and kind of acting up her parts for the videos and stuff, where she was thinking a lot about her grandfather who taught her a lot of things about like painting and plastering and so on. And through the process of being Anna and thinking about those feelings and being in that place, she came out the other side of the project with a plastering qualification, and she's now a qualified plasterer up in the sort of Midlands, if anybody wants to give her a call. She's very good at it. And that was really cool, because that was this really interesting example of like how my little game literally changed someone's life to an extent. And I love that. That is why I make the things I do. But there were some other broader things in terms of kind of broader findings. Community is really important for well-being. When you're doing these kinds of things, or even playing this game alone, it doesn't necessarily feel the same. Physical spaces are really important in pervasive games, so that's really cool. This idea of like having physical space as a play space within the world is an interesting idea. Having time to reflect in games is important, and then most importantly, I think, the developer experience is not the player experience, because my experience was not super great, but the player experience was very good generally. So how can we make this more sustainable? Here are a bunch of considerations for personal game development. I can't go through them all because I see I basically run out of time now. But broadly, so think about the idea of marketing the values in your game as opposed to saying that it's a personal game or saying it's a cozy game or an empathy game, because that might be more specific. Making these kinds of games is a little bit difficult, so just be prepared for that. Be flexible. Collaborate as much as possible. Don't do this alone. I tried it. It didn't work very well. Look after yourselves. This is the most important thing within this process. Is actually making personal games can be really, really difficult. So establish processes for that and just look after yourselves generally. Remember that the game and its reception is going to be very distinct from you or your experience. The game is going to reach people and they are going to like it, and that is great. It's going to be very different from your experience as a developer worrying about if people are playing it at all. Consider your audience during design. This is really important. It's something I missed out, and even earlier in the talk didn't really talk about, was this idea that like auteur-driven design is like, it's the designer's vision and it's making it for me, but ultimately your game is still going to be played by people. Even if it's a personal game, remembering that will help make sure it reaches an audience that loves it, and that's really important. The post-pandemic era might have distinct impacts on your game in terms of marketing, in terms of community, and so on. And then the most importantly, I think, especially with this talk, is talking about failure, right? And the idea that certainly within academic circles, this is one of the important things that we don't tend to talk about within game development. We talk about this amazing study, and we did this amazing study, and here's these amazing results. But I'm here to tell you that this was hard. It was super worth it, but it was hard at times. So here are a couple of limitations. I'm not going to go through too many of them because, again, we're running out of time. But yeah, obviously, this was just one game. I would love to see more people make more games and kind of think through and look at and study the entire process here. And ultimately, we need more robust frameworks to guide this kind of development, right? So a lot of these frameworks and these ideas came from my experience creating real-world games. But what about digital games? How does this apply to indie? How does this apply to AAA? How are we going to fit some of these considerations around smaller teams or larger teams or different kinds of projects? And then lastly, at some point you must ship, but it won't ship if no one is left to complete it. Take care of yourselves, everybody, is the thing that I want to leave everybody with. Here are some links if you want to play my game. Again, the game is super simple. It is literally just the website. You go onto the website and you scroll through each of the tasks. It takes about an hour to play. If you want to go home and play it by yourself and you feel warm and fuzzy inside, please let me know. There's a Discord server you can join. It's a little bit dead now, but we used to share a lot of our stories and a lot of our tasks there. And there's also a game trailer and some of Anna's stuff on YouTube if you want to have a look at that. And then lastly, thank you very much for this very long discussion. Please email me things if you have questions, or even tweet at me, X at me. I don't know what that is anymore. At 2 Lefts Right, or connect with me on LinkedIn if you want to ask some questions. I would really, truly love that. I'm so sorry that I'm not with you guys again today, but I hope that this talk was informative, and I will hopefully see you all at some point in the future. Take care.